All right. Example number one: method of track of safety, working on limits of train approaching requirement. Side A is the occupied track from vertical plane, nearing running the occupied, exceeding the outward following space adjacent control track. Working limits of the train approaching. A method of on-track safety. Side A, using receiving or a notification warning, movement of notification or warning for a number one cease work occupying predetermined place of safety, PPOS. Uh, we're going to go down there and then we're going to do the other requirements. Working limits number two, example. Using movements number one, ceasing working, occupy predetermined place of safety is notified to cease dot movement or number three. Example number three, working limits requirement for number track one. Upon notification, number track cease one occupying predetermined place of safety. Work is not required. Ceasing determination number track number three. Um, Method number four, train approaching warning. Upon movement of warning number one and or number three, cease the work occupying the predetermined place of safety. Number five, none of the work but the interior barrier. None but the method of on-track safety side. None but the interior track barrier. Work is prohibited on number one up to the barrier. Work is not required to the case between the barrier near running rail is occupied by the side A2 or A2 or during the movement of number one. Okay, number one on the rear tracks occupying number two track, where on-track safety is established working limits. Your example of working limits of the approaching train, side A, upon notification of warning number one, cease and occupy the predetermined place of safety, except for the work continuing during the movements. Number one, authorized at 25 miles or less, 40 passenger train, and if 25 spacing required. Working limits for example number two. Upon movement of notification of number one and number three, cease work and occupy on the predetermined place of safety, except for work is continuing during the movements of number one and number three, authorized 25 miles per hour, so 40 on a passenger train, if maintaining a 25-foot distance spacing. Example number three is a working limit upon movement and notification of number one, warning number three, cease the work occupying the determined place of safety, except works may continue during the movement. Number one and number three, authorized 25 or less than 40 miles per hour, less than the passenger train movements, if maintaining spacing. Alright, for train approaching, your requirements on the number two track, upon movement, warning number one and number three, cease work, occupy the predetermined place of safety, except for work may continue. Movements in number one and number three, authorized 25 miles or less, or 40 miles per hour on a passenger, if maintaining 25 feet of spacing. Example number six, none but with the interior barrier, work is not required to cease during the movement of number one. Okay, side B of your method of track safety. Number one, side B, work is not required to cease during the number one, and method of track on safety on side B not applicable because there's no adjacent track. Example number two, using a movement notification number three, cease work occupying the predetermined place of safety where it's not required to cease during the movement, and method of track safety on side B is work limits. Example 3, upon moving in number 3 on notification for number 1, cease work and occupy the predetermined place of safety. Train approach warning on the method of track safety on side B. 4, train approaching warning. Upon movement for number 3 and number 1, cease work and occupy the predetermined place of safety. Method of track safety on method. Train and approaching warning. Example 5, a none but interior barrier requirements. Work is not required to cease during the movement of number 1. Not applicable because there's no adjacent track. Also, 6 has but there's none but the interior bracket work is prohibited on A1. Work is not required to cease A2 during the movement on number 1 and number 3. Work is not required during the movements from number 1 upon movement notification warning number 3 cease to work occupying a predetermined plan of safety except for wars continuing during the movement number 3 authorizing 25 miles or less or 40 miles an hour for a passenger train of less than if maintaining 25 feet of spacing squared. Movement on notification warning number 3 cease work and occupied predetermined plan of safety. Work is not required to cease during the movement of number 1. Work limits of the side B. Work limits of train approaching warning. Alright, I gotta reflip this around. Alright, example 1. Your warning working limits of the train approaching on a number 1 track. You see a guy on side 1, side A, receiving notification warning movements. Notification on warning on number 1, cease work and occupy predetermined plan to place of safety. Your on-track equipment, and number 2, side A and side B. Side B, work and the required cease during number 1. Working limits. This has the side A and B, tracks 1, 2, and 3. Working limits, number 1, side A, upon movement notification 1 of work occupied and predetermined plan of safety, not required to cease during the movement number 3. Also on side B, movement and notification 3, work occupied predetermined plan of safety, work is not required to cease during the movements of number 1. So you have your on-track equipment, and number 2, this occupied track and movement and notification number 1 and number 3 working on the predetermined safety except for the work continuing during number 1 and number 3 during the 25 that are less than 25 foot of spacing. Work limited side A upon notification number 1 cease of occupying predetermined safety. Work is not required to cease during the number movement on number 3. Train approaching on track number 3. Side a movement warning number 3 notification number 1 cease work occupying a predetermined plan thing. Number 2 shows the occupied track worksheet and occupied track equipment. Track approaching on track number 1 upon movement and warning the number 1 and number 3 cease work on occupying predetermined plan of safety. Track approaching on track number 3, side B, movement management to number 3 or number 1, cease workload, occupied predetermined plan of safety. Enter barrier between the track number 1 and number 2. Side 1 work is not prohibited. Side A1 work is prohibited in number 1. Side B work is not required to cease during movements on number 1. Enter bracket between number 1 and number 2. Work limits of training approaching on number 3. Side B's modification warning. Cease the work on occupying predetermined plan of safety. Work is not required to cease during the management of number 1. Alright, train approaching on track number 1. Side A, movement of the management, warning of the number 1 and number 3 cease work occupying predetermined plan safety. Train approaching side B, management of number 3, number 1, cease work occupying predetermined plan of safety. Enter bracket. Side A1 is prohibited at number 1. Side B is working, not required to cease during the management of number 1. And interior barrier between track number 1 and 2. On track, side A1 is not side work. A1 work is prohibited on number 1. On track is on number 2. Your working limits on approaching on track number 3. Upon management and notification warning number 3, cease work occupying predetermined plan of safety. Work is not required to cease during the management movements on number 1. Alright, and then we're going to start out with 214, 337.